Okay, welcome back. So now it's time that we get into the nuts and bolts of the core components that we might use when delivering a physical activity coaching conversation. So when I'm delivering a physical activity coaching conversation, I'm thinking about 6 general things in the process. What are you currently doing for physical activity? What are the things that you want to do, maybe that you're excited about? How might you like to get into that goal setting? What are the things that you have available to you? What are the things that might get in the way? And how can we develop a plan together? Now, I should note that any sort of medical and health history information should be discussed with a qualified healthcare provider, which we've talked about previously. So that would again sort of fall out of scope to talk about that medical and health history for the purposes of exercise prescription. So starting with our first one, what is your current physical activity? So before we get into that, I like to ask the question like, is this something you want to talk about? Are you interested in being more physically active? If the answer is no, then I sort of go into this plant the seed. So if someone tells me that they're not currently interested in being physically active, I usually try 2 things before letting it go. So first, I ask them if they'd be willing to talk about why they're not interested in physical activity at this time. Sometimes it's not just that we don't want to be physically active. Sometimes there are things that have gotten in the way in the past that make being physically active hard. So if they're willing to have that conversation around barriers, then we can go down that route. Another thing that I might try is to explore values. Um, we often like to act in alignment with our values, and having a conversation about what some of the things might be that they value in their life outside of physical activity. So maybe that's things like community, family. Sometimes we can draw those parallels to physical activity if appropriate. Now, that being said, sometimes now is just not the time to have that physical activity conversation, and that's okay. So if that's the case, I plant the seed and say, if and when you might be ready and willing to have that conversation, just know that I'm here. Now, if they said, yes, let's go for it, I'm interested in being physically active, then we proceed. And we'll start talking a bit about what their current physical activity is. So starting with a question about, tell me about what you're currently doing for physical activity or movement. And I like to preface with the caveat that if it's nothing, that's okay. Not everyone is physically active, and it's great that we're here to have this conversation in the first place. So when we're discussing physical activity, it's really important that we have an understanding of where someone is at. So we have to get a bit of a sense of, what are you doing for physical activity? How often are you doing that? How hard are you working? And how much are you doing? How long, for example, are you going for a wheel? Those sorts of things. This becomes especially helpful if you're sharing this information with a qualified exercise professional. It helps them to get a sense of where they're at and so that they can meet them with where they're currently at. Then we might have a conversation about what their goals are. So, what would you like to be doing for physical activity? And we're asking kind of the same questions. What would you like to do? How much? How often? When do you want to start? The most important question that I'll often ask, though, related to goal setting is, why is this important to you? Why is it that you have this goal of, increasing the number of times that you go to the gym? What's your motivator for that? And we can keep coming back to that reason. Now, our preferences, so we might set this like number goal, but how we get there, we really want to tie into what it is that gets us excited. So maybe it's a question of, what have you done in the past that you've enjoyed for physical activity? Keeping in mind, however, when we're working with individuals with spinal cord injury, not everyone is ready to discuss past experiences. So, respect the individual with where they're at and adapt the conversation accordingly. But you all know how to do that well. So another question that I might ask is there anything that you'd be interested to try? And that could be related to the activity itself. There could be questions around whether they have preferences to be outside in nature, doing things independently or with others, and whether they have people in their support system that they would prefer to exercise with. These all just kind of help us shape what are the things that we would want to do related to our goals. Now, there are many ways that we can explore different types of activities, and I like to kind of think of this ramp. So, starting with, less structured ways of adding movement to our day are things like our everyday active, and I'll give you some examples of each of these. Then we kind of move across to our accessible activities, which are more organized, structured activities, all the way through to adapted sport, which can come as competitive or more recreational, just for fun, but again, more structured around that sport idea. So I'll go through each of those. With our everyday active, we're just trying to find small ways to fit movement into our day. I think it's a really important message to stress that all movement counts. We used to say that you had to accumulate at least 5 to 10 minutes of movement in a continuous bout. Now we know that's not the truth. So everything from, say, for example, if you chose, to wheel across the street instead of taking your car. Doing things like maybe adding some small resistance training exercises with a band while watching the TV. Maybe something's on Netflix commercial, those ads that you have to, sit through all the time now, unless you have the paid version. Adding a little bit of movement during that time. Um, Thinking about what we might do that relates to just your activities of daily living. So, taking the dog out for a walk or a roll, playing with your kids, having a dance party totally counts. Maybe you've decided that when you go to the grocery store, you're going to park in the spot that's a bit further away from your destination. So you get a little bit more of a walk or a wheel in. Choosing to go for a walk or a wheel at the mall when the weather is bad. Or maybe you're a busy person, you're constantly in meetings. Can we move any of those to phone where you can walk or wheel at the same time? Or maybe together having a walking or wheeling meeting. Now, as we move up the ramp to our accessible activities that have a bit more structure to them, I separate these into our aerobic and strengthening activities, but in reality, sometimes these cross over to one or another. So aerobic is kind of like our cardio, that's like the huff and puff, the things that we're doing continuously that gets our heart rate raised and our breathing a bit higher. It could just be things like going out for a cycle or a hand cycle. Maybe it's stuff that you are doing in the gym, like using an arm ergometer. Um, Swimming can be an option. Of course, there are considerations for the feasibility of that. Um, Maybe it's an exercise video or an exercise class at home, or getting into sport at more of the recreational level. And maybe you just love things like dance. For your strengthening activities, I think it's helpful to note that the equipment doesn't really matter as much. It's really about how hard the individual is working at the end of their set. So, a set is when you do a full number of repetitions of an exercise until the end, and that's that grouping is the set. So, at the end of the set, if we can push ourselves to say a 7 out of 10, of course, there are exceptions to that, but if we can push ourselves to a moderate intensity or 6 to 7 out of 10, then we can usually see health benefits regardless of the type of equipment that we're using. So maybe that's resistance bands, that's our sort of lowest cost options. Maybe we're using things like weights, but we're using potentially alternatives for weights. I always say anything you buy from Costco is a good piece of strength training equipment. Um, Bottles, any other sort of household items. I know we've used things like uh, broomsticks as an example. We can get creative with those. And then there are things that you might use at the gym, things like our cable pulleys, free weights, body weight exercises. But important to know as well that things like yoga, Pilates, Tai Chi, these all count, and we have evidence for improving strength in. Maybe you're looking to spice things up though too. So I know for myself, I can't stand watching a wall while I do, say, the arm cycle ergometer or I'm on a bike. So I like to spice in some interval training. And interval training, well, traditionally people think of as high intensity interval training. There's time and place for that. if you've worked towards high intensity, but perhaps also making some recommendations around adding moderate intensity interval training if that's not where the individual is at just yet. So these are just some examples of different protocols of how to do interval training. There is actually no best interval protocol. So general principle is work a little bit harder for a short period of time and rest or do active rest. So perhaps, spinning at a lower intensity for a short period of time and continue to repeat. And it's that sort of cyclical up and down of intensity that we're looking for in that interval training. Onto our last section here in our activity ramp is our sport category. So this can be competitive, as I mentioned, or it can be recreational, but I do often, before making recommendations, consider cost. Sport can be costly, especially if it requires specialized equipment. It's great to know that you can basically think of any sport and someone has found a way to make it happen. So, even looking at rock climbing, there are specialized ways and adapted devices that can make rock climbing a reality. So part of that is knowing what's available, exploring those options with your client and where that interest might lie, but then recognizing that cost might be a significant barrier to getting involved. So this is just a list here. Doesn't have to be prescriptive, but might be a starting place to explore where your client may or may not be interested in getting involved with sport. The next piece that I like to talk about is resources. We can have all these great ideas for what we want to do for physical activity, but if we don't have the resources or we're making recommendations that require the use of a gym and someone doesn't have a gym membership, that's an important consideration. So some of the questions that you might ask are, what sort of gyms or recreation centers do you have available to you? Do you have equipment at home? Is there anyone that can provide assistance or support? Is there any funding available for the types of activities that you'd like to do? If you're not sure, SCI has an amazing info line that has, I don't know, they magically have all the answers, is what I've found in my experience. And if they don't have the answers, they know who to talk to and we'll get back to you. So many of you might be familiar already with the SCI info line. Otherwise, there are other resources, for example, like the Physical Activity Guidelines or SCI Canada. Okay, so here's where we get into where we spend oftentimes the bulk of our time in our conversations in physical activity coaching. And when I ask the question of, what are the things that might get in the way, I'm often thinking about, is the problem a knowledge problem? Is it a motivation thing? Is it that the individual is having trouble remembering or perhaps even creating a habit? Is it something in their environment or perhaps the people around them? Or is there something physical that might be preventing them from being physically active? So those are the general categories that I'm thinking about. And thinking about those categories sometimes helps me to find some of the solutions or to co-develop what those solutions might look like. So some of the common barriers and potential solutions that you might discuss with your client, and again, kind of lumping them into these different categories. We might hear things like, I'm worried exercise isn't safe for me, or I'm new to it. How do I get started? Or where do I go? So some potential solutions that you might explore. If the challenge is that the individual is worried about exercise being safe, first and foremost, exercise is safe. The benefits of exercise far outweigh the risks for individuals with spinal cord injury. There's, of course, time and place where knowing how to dose exercise becomes important. And so sometimes it does mean connecting with an exercise professional, like a kinesiologist or a physiotherapist, as an example, to help them figure out what dose and how might you exercise to do that safely. And hopefully they're able to then provide that education so that the individual can continue to exercise independently. Something else that we might be considerate of is, where do we start? So the physical activity guidelines that are specific for people with spinal cord injury can be a great starting place, and we have some more resources on that. Maybe it's, again, connecting with an exercise professional, but a sort of a a nice starting place can be group classes. It means that we can engage in exercise in a social environment, but also you might start to develop the toolbox of the types of exercises that you might do. The other thing that I really like to stress is that all movement counts. I'll say it one more time, all movement counts. And so exercise is one way in which we can move our body. It might mean going to the gym. But there's so many ways in which we can move our bodies. Maybe it's sport, maybe it's having a dance party with the kids. You don't always have to go to your special place with your special clothes. Exercise can happen at home. So just sort of reiterating that movement can come in many shapes and forms. That was a big check mark that I gave there. Okay. If you're not sure of where your client's not sure of which gym to use or where to be active, co-conducting a search of options can be helpful, particularly looking for those that might be close to where the individual lives or is accessible by public transit if they don't have access to a car. I also find really helpful is if there is a community center that is near the individual and we're not sure if they have accessible equipment. When I make that call, I don't ask them, do you have accessible equipment? Most people don't know what that means. I'll usually ask for things, do you have a freestanding pulley? Do you have things like an arm bike? Do you have things like grip assistance gloves? Those are pieces of equipment that are commonly becoming more available in gyms. Using free weights is an obvious one, but being able to have active hands or grip assistance gloves if gripping is an issue, right? So having those conversations, being specific about what it is that you might be looking for is usually a better conversation than asking if they have an accessible gym. You'll get different answers for that. If we're moving on now, so that's kind of what we get in most commonly as the knowledge bucket of barriers. If the challenge is related to motivation or remembering, it's like, I planned to go to the gym, but then I kind of got to the end of the day and it kind of slipped my mind. Or maybe you just haven't found that routine. You might be getting things like, I'm having trouble sticking to my routine or fitting exercise into my schedule. If that's the case there, if it really is a thing of like, we're not motivated, sometimes we use things like reward, and I'll talk about that later. It can be scheduling into your phone and having a reminder for when it is that you've scheduled that gym session or that exercise session. Keeping track and monitoring of how you're doing. So how your client is sticking to their plan. I'll talk a bit about action planning, but really important about that action planning is following up. So to say, it's great that we've set this goal and we've got a plan. The next time I see you, I'll follow up to see how you did. And then there's the accountability piece that maybe you provide in that follow-up, but perhaps also involving friends and family might be most appropriate in that follow-up. Okay, here's the reality. Sometimes exercise is boring. So again, doesn't have to happen at the gym. Maybe we're trying to find alternative activities. Again, all movement matters. It all counts. Find the things that are perhaps more exciting. Or maybe taking more of a focus on the social elements. So if we're not excited about the movement itself, maybe it's that we're getting the opportunity to connect with others that we're excited to see. If someone feels like they're not yet seeing the benefits of exercise, that can be for a couple reasons. One, sometimes certain benefits take some time to develop. So for example, things like your cardio fitness, so being able to go for longer without having to stop, sometimes that takes some time. The nice thing is oftentimes we do see strength benefits usually pretty quickly if someone is new to exercise, but maybe they're not seeing the benefits for whatever reason. So a couple things is one, to perhaps not just focus on those performance, physical benefits, but the benefits that might relate to, social health, mental or emotional health, like how we feel after exercise could be something to hone in on. It is also possible that if they're not seeing benefits, it's perhaps that the dosing or how hard they're working or how their program has been set up isn't tailored for the individual. And so that's where you might then refer to an exercise professional. I've also heard cases where, you sort of feel like, or the client is feeling like everyone is watching them. Maybe it's hard to leave the house. So yes, home exercise can be an option. Sometimes it's nice to attend with a buddy. But in certain cities, we do have some SCI specific or disability specific gyms where there's less of that feeling like we're being watched. I like check marks, that's fun. All right, so moving into our last three groupings here around environment, social, and physical. So in our environment, we did touch on this a little bit, but sometimes the gym maybe isn't accessible or the individual doesn't have access to transportation. So going through that process of problem solving what potential resources might be available to them, coming back to that idea of the home exercise gym, and perhaps also thinking about, if it's not a specialized gym, how can we find ways to adapt exercise in community gyms? And we'll talk about that at the end of our modules. And another plug for the SCI BC Infoline. I think they're just a really excellent resource, though many of you already have many of these resources on hand. If financial means are a barrier, for example, gym memberships, not cheap. There are quite a few free online home exercise classes and YouTube videos, which we'll also link you to. Perhaps you've got a role there in finding ways for financial support. And just coming back again, exercise doesn't have to happen in a gym. So maybe there's other options for movement that they might be interested in that might be free or low cost. Coming back to that activity ramp. If they don't have exercise, there's so many at-home substitutes, which we did mention previously. But I'll just highlight resistance bands. You can usually buy them for, say, $5 to $10 online, 15 if you're getting a whole pack. And you can do just about anything with a resistance band as you can with a machine or a free weight. So might require maybe looking at some videos and connecting them that way, or with an exercise professional if we're not sure how. But those are generally the piece of equipment that I almost always recommend for someone to have. Getting into the social side of things, sometimes, yeah, we enjoy doing exercise with others. So if they don't have someone perhaps in their life to exercise with, maybe it's thinking about those online or in-person group exercise classes. Sometimes being engaged with other SCI community events helps you to meet those people. So it might not come in with the intention first for exercise, but could evolve into something later. And then getting involved with sport is a great way to find people who are sort of like-minded and also interested in exercise, to find that exercise buddy. Certainly, this is something that might have been experienced where feeling sort of judgment or negative attitudes. Again, peers can be a great resource for that, but also connecting with exercise centers with trained staff. This isn't always possible, especially if you're in a smaller community, but those larger city centers often have specialized exercise centers where staff have better training. Perhaps it's that you might need, or your client might need assistance in getting set up with exercise equipment. So that just again comes back to, you can see the pattern here for the social is like getting involved with people, finding the right centers, and potentially taking advantage of our online services if in person isn't possible. The last one that I'll talk about here today is that physical. So many individuals might experience fatigue, lack of energy. So the things that we'll often recommend here are using things like an action plan, which I'll talk about, finding things where we're actually excited about, like when movement doesn't feel like something you have to do, but it's something that you're excited to do. Sometimes that can help to find a little bit more of that energy for the activity and being able to show up. There also might be certain times of day where the individual has better energy. So planning exercise around that. And then scheduling exercise with someone. If we know that someone is waiting for us to go for our walk or wheel, sometimes we're able to push through a little bit more of that fatigue and find that energy. This is a tricky one. Pain. Maybe it's because of something, maybe it's a joint injury, maybe it's an overuse injury, from doing the same things repeatedly. My first advice is to start low and slow. Sometimes it means that we actually need to focus on moving other areas of the body, which might then require an exercise professional to help individuals think through. But any movement is better than no movement. Something is better than nothing. So perhaps even just recommending to focus on other areas of the body that are not affected or are less affected by pain can be a good strategy. And then pressure sores. So I'd like to give some education on ways in which we can prevent pressure sores. So things like when you are exercising, doing what I call a butt break. So kind of lifting yourself out of your chair, shifting side to side if you're able, whatever works best, just to help bring that blood flow, back to the buttocks while we're exercising. If there are any potentially sensitive spots that have had some exposure. So say, for example, someone was on the arm ergometer and they might not have that core control, then we might see a lot of body weight shifting. Having someone check, for example, the back, where their back might be contacting their backrest for any signs of skin irritation or early signs of pressure sores can be a useful strategy. Other things there are putting in, recommending to use blocks or towels that can help to prevent and sort of have us wedged in the chair a little bit more securely so we don't have that shifting. Otherwise, just comes back to that idea of, moving what we can that maybe avoids the affected area. Okay. So those are some of the things that we might see when we ask the questions like, what might be some of the things that might get in the way of being physically active? Are there things that have stopped you in the past? But sometimes we do need to dig a little bit deeper. And so that's where I like to use the combi. So if the immediate stuff, we've kind of explored those, we tried to address the barriers that seem to be most salient or most obvious, and we're still just not hitting where we want to be, then sometimes we have to ask some more probing questions. So the combi is essentially, it's like the three things you need to commit a crime: capability, opportunity, motivation. Um, so it gets me just asking, and it's okay if, you don't have to get too deep into the theory of it, but it means that I'm generally asking questions about, do you know about XYZ related to physical activity? Do you have the ability to? Is there something stopping you there? Within opportunities, do you have the people around you that can support you to do this? Are there resources? Is time an issue? Is access an issue? And then related to the motivation pieces, like, is this something that you want to do, something that you've planned to do? Are you perhaps having trouble remembering? Is it something that you forget or something that you haven't quite developed into a habit for? So these might be some of the more probing questions, but overall, what I'm usually looking for is, I call them breadcrumbs. So when someone mentions something that might be our sticking point, um, sometimes we get really caught up in just going through the checklist of, okay, I got to move on to my next thing. Like if someone gives you a breadcrumb, right, that's a really great opportunity, especially when it comes to barriers, that you might want to then go down that rabbit hole with them and explore and get a better understanding of what it is that they're experiencing. So sometimes these questions might be sort of the opening to get into those, but once they sort of give you that breadcrumb, take that opportunity to then explore if they're willing. Okay, so now you've gotten to near the end here where we're thinking about how we might develop a plan. And these are just, sure, fancy things that we might call behavior change techniques, but ultimately these are just some strategies that can really help us to move from, wanting to do something, but perhaps not following through with the things that we wanted to do. Okay, so goal setting and action planning. These two are in some ways related. We'll start with goal setting. So some people will teach the SMART goal setting. For me, I like to use the acronym CARE. So when we put together goals, they should be co-developed, in that I can't decide for my client what's the right goal for them, but I can support them in helping to identify what is the right fit for a goal. So, as we're having that conversation, we want to be discussing whether that goal is something that is achievable or attainable. It should be relevant, which is similar to what some might define in that SMART goal setting. So, why is this goal important? So, in this example here, going to the gym twice a week, well, it's because I want to get stronger and maintain my independence to do transfers, right? And then as we look through that goal, we're asking questions around whether we are equipped. So, are we committed to this goal? Are we confident about this goal? Do we have the supports and resources to be able to do this? And do we know how to meet this goal? So, that's goal setting in a nutshell. If you're the type of person where planning actually works really well for you, and you're the type of person that a schedule is something that you like to use in your day to day, or at least feels like it's a fit, then action planning takes that goal setting and makes it really specific. Specific to the point where you can put it into your calendar. So you've been able to define not just what the activity is, but where it's going to happen, at what time, and on which days, where you can put it into your calendar as an event with the amount of information that you have. Other strategies that you might use, if someone is expressing, being new to something or not having confidence, making small changes and celebrating those victories can be, take small wins that end up being big wins. So if you meet them with where they're at, maybe they are just starting at the gym. Even if it means that, your first session is half an hour, that's great. It's really just about meeting them with wherever they are currently at for their physical activity and just adding a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, and then being able to celebrate those victories. Now, I know that we have the spinal cord injury physical activity guidelines. It's important to note that the guidelines might not be an appropriate first goal for everyone. So if someone is starting with 0 minutes of physical activity, sometimes the twice a week, 20 minutes of at least moderate intensity physical activity plus strength training twice a week maybe is too much to start. So maybe it's once a week. Maybe it's starting with just the aerobic or the cardio guidelines. And then monitoring. This is actually a really powerful tool that we have. So whether it is that they themselves are monitoring, that could be on a paper calendar. Some people are using fitness trackers. There are caveats to that though. Sometimes fitness tracking doesn't always track physical activity quite as well when it comes to things like wheeling or resistance training. So treat the information there with a grain of salt. If they say they did a session at, and even though their watch didn't pick it up, believe them. And then maybe it's you yourself, or a peer, a family member, someone who they might be accountable to. So even just adding in that sentence of, hey, I love the goals that we've set this week. The next time I see you, we'll check in to see how you did. Maybe it's some of those, I know for my mom, uh, when she was getting into her strength training program, she would text us every day and let us know when she finished it. So, whatever it is that works for the individual that helps us to monitor, if you're going to put your money down on one of these techniques for someone who wants to be physically active but hasn't quite made it there, this monitoring piece, or essentially just like keeping track of your progress, is a really powerful technique. And then prompts and cues. So if the problem is, that we've forgotten, sometimes having something to remind us is really valuable. So there's obviously the phone reminders. Sometimes it's putting your equipment next to your bed or your office desk, something that's going to remind you, like, oh yeah, like I said I was going to do that today, right? And then, of course, maybe involving those that maybe have a bit of pull with us to remind us, whether that's a partner or a friend, as a bit of a prompt or a cue. Now, this last one here around rewards, I would say isn't for everyone. Rewards, sometimes we can call this as sort of like an external motivator. So something outside of ourselves that's getting us to do it. It can be a really great way to start out or maybe help us get back on track. The ideal is though is that we move away from a rewards-based system to what we call that intrinsic motivation, where we just find enjoyment, we find fun, like we ourselves are seeing the benefits, and so we want to do it for ourselves. It takes some time to develop that, and sometimes even just finding the right activities that fulfill that need. So in the interim, though, you might offer rewards or some suggestions around, something as simple as verbal encouragement, like, "Hey, you did a great job this week. That's fantastic." But maybe it's other things like, treating yourself to a manicure, going for a dinner outing if you met your goals at the end of the month, whatever it is that might provide that external motivation, at least to get started. So, tying this all together, asking that question, first of all, is this something that we want to have a conversation about? And if they've given us the yes, then we can proceed to where we'll talk about what are you currently doing for physical activity? What would you like to do, both in terms of your goals, but as well as your preferences for what that looks like? What sort of resources do you have available to you? And what are the things that might get in the way? And then how do we perhaps develop a plan together to address those challenges? Okay, so that's everything I have for us on this side of the module.